Hello, everyone, and welcome to Preemie Chats, a space where we connect, learn, and share stories about the world of prematurity. I'm Leah Whitehead. I'm the proud parent of a preemie and a former journalist. I'm so honored to have you join us today. As we gather virtually across Canada, we acknowledge the Indigenous peoples who are the traditional caretakers of the lands on which we live and work. From coast to coast to coast, these lands have been home to First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people since time immemorial. We honor their enduring presence and their deep relationship with the land, waters, and skies. Preemie Chats is brought to you by the Canadian Premature Babies Foundation. You may also know them as CPBF, a parent-led charitable organization dedicated to supporting families, advocating for the needs of premature babies, and providing the latest information and resources to help parents and caregivers navigate this journey. So whether you are a parent, a healthcare professional, a researcher, or someone interested in understanding more about preterm birth, you're in the right place. Together, we're building a supportive community where stories are shared, questions are answered, new evidence is explored, and no one feels alone. Please visit our website. There it is on the screen, canadianpreemies.org. There you will find helpful resources, our latest projects, and most importantly, a community of people who want to see our little ones thrive. If you're watching live today, I invite you to please join the conversation. Share your questions and comments in the chat, and we'll try to get to them at some point during our program today. And if you're watching a recorded session, you can still reach us, connect with us through our website. It's through meaningful discussions like the one we're about to have, where we advance practice and grow together. So let us know where you're watching from. It's always interesting to see where our viewers are tuning in from. Bring your questions, bring your experience. We just love to have many voices join us. We love hearing from you, our audience. Today, we're opening a conversation that requires care, humility, and a willingness to listen. We're looking at the factors that influence vaccine uptake within Indigenous communities, factors that are complex. A recent study published in the Canadian Medical Association Journal sheds light on how historical and ongoing colonialism, systemic racism, and mistrust in healthcare systems continue to shape vaccine hesitancy today. To guide us through this conversation, I'm grateful to welcome Dr. Jairus Swidrovich. And you may recognize that name because Jairus joined us earlier this fall for our RSV workshop, where we only just had time to touch the surface of this topic. It was like 10 or 15 minutes. So I'm genuinely glad that we get to revisit it more in depth today. The study we'll be exploring highlights the importance of culturally safe care, community-led health initiatives, and the central role of Indigenous knowledges in supporting informed and autonomous health decisions. Our hope is that this discussion deepens our understanding and helps us move toward more equitable public health strategies. Dr. Jaris Swidrovich is an assistant professor and Indigenous engagement lead in the Leslie Dan Faculty of Pharmacy at the University of Toronto and the founder and chair of the Indigenous Pharmacy Professionals of Canada. Dr. Swidrovich is a queer, two-spirit, Saulteaux, and Ukrainian pharmacist from Yellow Quill First Nation, who also serves as the co-scientific director of Natawahoan, a First Nations research network supporting researchers, students, and First Nations health leaders and communities in Saskatchewan and beyond. Welcome, Jaris. Thanks for being here today.
Thank you so much for your intro, your comments, your land acknowledgement, and to everybody joining, whether now live or if you're watching this later on. I thank you for that. I will go ahead and right here. So it looks like folks can see this. I've got a little bit more of a self-introduction built into these slides. So I'm just going to get right into it, but I'll highlight for you that on this slide and also the very final one, I've listed my own social media handles, and my email is also listed on the final slide for folks to share any comments, questions, epiphanies, engage with me however you like. I know that communication just via email alone or otherwise is maybe not always the most welcome. So we already heard a land acknowledgement, and again, I thank you for that. I think about this all the time, and I've seen several practices in this regard, and even some kind of humorous takes that give people a chance to stop and reflect what we're really doing with land acknowledgements. One of my favorites is in a live, like in-person presentation where the presenter will go and just simply take a laptop or take an iPhone or ask who has $50 with them or something like that, and then they go take it, come back to the front of the stage and say, I'd like to acknowledge that this is Leah Whitehead's, and then put it in my pocket and keep going and never give it back. But then ask that Leah sings me happy birthday every year on July 1st, and all the stuff that comes with that. It's just a really interesting take on land acknowledgements and what we're truly accomplishing with them. I don't think that we should stop them, but I think that there should always be some commentary and personalization with that. So some of my own personalization, again, comes with these next few slides of a further self-introduction. My spirit name is Wapiska Kinu, or White Eagle, and I walk with two clans, the Otter Clan and Bear Clan. I always recognize my white-presenting nature and the fact that I also am white. My dad is white Ukrainian, and my mom was a Saulteaux First Nations woman. We are from Yellow Quill First Nation, which is Treaty 4 territory in Saskatchewan. It was also noted that yes, I'm First Nations, two-spirit, queer. I use he and they pronouns, and I also live with a permanent, long-term, invisible disability with respect to my hearing. I've spent most of my life in urban and suburban Saskatoon, or Treaty 6 in the Métis homelands, and now live in Toronto, or Tekaronto, Treaty 13, or Dishwaswun Treaty territory. It's common practice for Indigenous folks to share more about who we are versus, our name, title, degrees, universities, number of publications, that kind of thing. It's really, who are you? Who's your mom, your grandma, your aunties? What's your community? Who claims you, and who do you claim? So I include this in all of my presentations myself, as well as this era of pretendianism I talk about. So people who have faked their indigeneity has caused a lot of problems in our community. And unfortunately, the spotlight of that issue ends up being shone on First Nations, Métis, Inuit folks, but the whole point is that these folks are not First Nations, Métis, or Inuit. These are non-Indigenous peoples claiming indigeneity, and a lot of harm can happen with that. So here's my family. My family names are Kwakatus, LaPlante, Gilbert, and Elder. My Ukrainian side, Pasachnik and Swidrovich. On the top left here, you see my great-grandmother, Laura Gilbert, my grandmother in the middle, Marina Gilbert, or later Marina Elder, and then my mother, Cheryl or Sherry Elder, that later became Swidrovich. She took my dad's Ukrainian name. My two sisters here, my great-grandfather on the bottom right, who was a traditional Soto medicine man, and even a copy of my status card that shows my community of Yellow Quill First Nation, my spirit name, my name, and otherwise. I'm also a drag queen, and this comes into play particularly in the space of pediatrics. So there's a lot of work coming soon that you can watch for. Prescription. Sometimes folks read the name and don't get the reference, but prescription. I'm a pharmacist. So Pris is really here for a lot of different purposes, but it started out of pediatric purposes. So Pris's debut was at the International Symposium on Pediatric Pain, where she hosted a talk show with academics from Stanford, Sydney, Australia, and the University of British Columbia called Pain and Pride, Navigating Chronic Pain in Trans and Queer Youth. So you can find her on Instagram at Prescription, spelled exactly how you saw, and keep in touch with all of the work that she is doing in the pediatric space, but even in several other spaces. But this is certainly part of my whole identity, hence why it's part of my introduction today. Canada has a very dark history and many ongoing dark realities with respect to the treatment of Indigenous children and peoples. All of this influences our decision-making about vaccinations. The study that was noted in the introduction that was published in the Canadian Medical Association journal is mine, that I co-wrote with Dr. Ian Mosby, who's a historian, a white settler historian, and the two of us wrote this article on vaccine hesitancy or vaccine decision-making among Indigenous peoples in Canada. That article and what my previous 10-minute contribution was referred to as well only captured really high-level pieces, whereas this presentation is going to actually show the pieces that otherwise would have been captured in high level. So as an example, in a 10-minute presentation, if I was a realtor, I would tell you how many bedrooms, how many bathrooms, parking are available in a particular home. But in this version of the presentation, I'm showing you each bedroom and I'm showing you each bathroom and telling you the story of the place. So it's less high level and more quite direct, of which I've infused some personal takes and personal story, and certainly some of the experiences and literature that was captured in the Canadian Medical Association journal article. I showed you pictures of these folks already. This is my great-grandmother and my grandmother. On the left now is my grandmother, Marina Gilbert, or Marina Elder, and on the right is Laura Gilbert. Both of them attended residential schools in Canada, specifically the Gordon Indian Residential School in Saskatchewan, which was also the last one to close in Canada in Saskatchewan in 1996. So I was 10 and residential schools were still happening here in Canada, and I'm only 39 right now. We heard so much about what happened during this time, and this is not the focus of this presentation, but I have to talk about it a little bit in order to appreciate the whole process that Indigenous peoples take when it comes to vaccine decision making. We saw statistics like the one you see on this screen here that notes that your odds of dying were higher by attending residential schools versus serving in World War II. These numbers were based on an estimate of 2, 3, maybe 4,000 children dying in residential schools across the country for the entire time that residential schools existed. Keep in mind, this is children dying in what was supposed to be a school. And unfortunately, that estimate was far too low. So these statistics are extraordinarily wrong. There were over 130 residential schools, and by the time that we've only searched 11 of those 130 schools, over 10,000 bodies of children in unmarked graves were discovered after, again, searching just 11 of those 130, whereas a previous estimate was considered to be 2, 3, 4,000 of all 130 plus. It was far more than that. And there are so many newborns, infants, that we'll never even know about. We'll never find even an unmarked grave because they were disposed of immediately after birth. There could be no evidence that children were being born in residential schools to these two children, to young girls, because the only men allowed there were priests. And so too many of my own elders and community members have shared stories of witnessing the disposal of a brand newborn baby. In this country, in the 1940s and 50s, nutritional experiments were performed on children in Indian residential schools. Children were kept on starvation-level diets. They were given or denied vitamins, minerals, certain foods. And it was the Canadian government who approved these experiments to continue. They didn't initiate by the government, but once the government found out about it, they thought it was a great idea and said to keep going. The Canadian government also created segregated Indian hospitals. There's a really wonderful, although not wonderful, book called Separate Beds. Separate Beds, 2 words. It's a really great depiction and storytelling about what Indian hospitals were. But Indigenous peoples were seen as being less worthy of higher quality care offered in regular hospitals. There certainly was horrific treatment that took place, medical experiments performed without consent. The Indian Act was later amended. This is official Canadian legislation that was amended that made it a crime for Indigenous people to refuse to see a doctor, to refuse to go to hospital, and to leave hospital before discharge. RCMP, which were created, by the way, only to control Indians at first. Certainly their scope has evolved since. But the RCMP had the authority to arrest Indigenous patients who left and return them to hospital or to jail. Patients who died while in an Indian hospital were not even returned to their communities, and they were buried at the nearest cemetery in unmarked graves, forever lost to their families. And these hospitals remained in operation in Canada until 1981. I was only born 5 years later. Both historically and even currently, First Nations children on reserve, which is a federal responsibility. Our education is chronically underfunded between $2,000 and $8,000 per child compared to provincial schools. In 2009, half-ish, or quite more than half, 726 of the 803 then on-reserve schools were inspected, and half of these schools were considered in good condition, and the other half were not. 21% were not inspected whatsoever. Again, with respect to children and the realities that children have and continue to face among First Nations, Métis, Inuit families in this country, we need to think about the 60s scoop. The 60s scoop in the province of Saskatchewan, the official name there was called AIM, or Adopt Indian Métis. This program became a huge source of pride for the government of Saskatchewan. In fact, in an internal memo from September 1973, the director of that AIM program in Saskatchewan suggested that one of the supervisors, who was based in North Battleford, be named Salesperson of the Year in recognition of the number of children he made wards of the province eligible for adoption. By being a ward of the province, it means that you have legally, but quite truly illegally, taken a child from their home, from their parent or parents, and made them property of the respective province. And so this person was rewarded for that. And here's an actual copy of that memo where the director has suggested that this person be called Salesperson of the Year for forcibly removing Indigenous children from their homes. In fact, below the colonial border, which we never recognized as a separate country, it was just the next community over. But below that colonial border of the United States, as we now call it, you could purchase an Indigenous child for $10 from your local priest. We still aren't treating Indigenous birthing parents. I use that word as a gender inclusive word for all gender identities of folks who might be capable of pregnancy and actually have a pregnancy and deliver a child. But my home hospital in Saskatoon, connected to the faculties of medicine and pharmacy and nursing, it's all one building. They put on their own press conference recently announcing that they have been forcing and coercing Indigenous women or Indigenous birthing parents into sterilization. So if a woman was presenting for appendix surgery, let's say, and went to sign her consent form, sometimes they have added in there, like, please tie my tubes, but they don't tell her. And she signs consent for appendix surgery, not knowing that she's getting her appendix surgery and tubal ligation. Or alternatively, physicians, medical teams have told the woman that this is in here in the consent form and basically forced her or coerced her into signing it, being made to feel so poorly about being a parent that they just felt they had no other choice but to sign this consent for tubal ligation. It's still going on, even though that press conference was not that long ago. Sometimes folks think, well, at least that was, dealt with. No, it hasn't been. We're still seeing this happen all over the country every day. Indigenous women are experiencing this all the time, and I can't tell you how many Indigenous women I worked with in Saskatoon as well who were facing this all the time. So much so that one form of trauma-informed care or a trauma-informed approach of working with Indigenous peoples, families, women, birthing parents is to not even use the term social worker. And I don't mean that as a disrespect to social workers. I just mean that what has gone on in this country until now, our communities have seen the social workers show up to their house and take these children, or a social worker make a notion on the hospital chart that this baby should be apprehended, this newborn should be apprehended, premature or not. There's this general sentiment that Indigenous women, Indigenous families aren't fit to be parents or family members of new babies. We've been trying to work together to achieve reconciliation, and there's this organization called the Yellowhead Institute that started an annual report card since the release of the TRC calls to action that happened 10 years ago now, in 2015. Now we're at 2025, but 0 calls to action were completed in 2023, and it was so abysmal the few years prior to that the Yellowhead Institute stopped doing these annual report cards after this one. But of those 94 calls to action, 81 remain unfulfilled. Again, with our treatment of children and our non-treatment of children within First Nations, Métis, Inuit communities, all of this comes into play. We have been traumatized as an entire community of Indigenous peoples with every one of these things that has happened and continues to happen. So when our governments, as a broad term, introduce a new vaccine or existing vaccine with new recommendations of when it should be administered, etc., there's just too much that has happened and continues to happen that makes us feel a little bit weary. So this is what I'm continuing to share. I feel like folks haven't really heard about the 60 Scoop. When I talked about that Salesperson of the Year, here is a newspaper article from Saskatoon, my home city, where you can see Adopt Indian Métis, which was the name of the AIM program. And then looking at the title here, Giving Children White Parents. So again, this was very much seen as a huge favor being done to First Nations and Métis families by giving these children white parents. Even when the parents didn't want the kids taken and the kids did not want to be taken, it happened anyway. against everybody's will, because the dominant population, our elected governments, decided that white families and white parents would be better for everybody. First Nations and Métis children were put into classified ads like this one. You see Kent, Donna, and Diane. They basically advertised them and sold them off to make them attractive to potential buyers or foster parents who could then later go on to adopt these children. And let's keep in mind, people were given financial incentive to foster First Nations and Métis children as well. Kent, 8, is a tall, lean, athletic-looking boy. Active and energetic, he enjoys outdoor activities and is an avid hockey player. A grade 4 student, Kent enjoys school but does have difficulty with some of his schoolwork. This is improving and he appears to be making steady progress. Although pleasant and cooperative, Kent can be rambunctious at times and needs firm and consistent control. A likable lad, he could be a stimulating addition to a family with other children close to his age. And then again, a similar type of description about Donna and Diane. This is not Kent or Donna or Diane. This is my Uncle Perry, my Auntie Crystal, and my Auntie Carmen. My mom and her 9 other siblings, all 10 of them, were put into ads like this one. They were all taken as part of the 60s scoop. The first time my mom was taken, she was 2, and she never really remembered that, of course. She was only 2 years old. Put into several different foster homes, nearly every single one incredibly abusive, but it was always her who was the problem, not the abusive parents or abusive families. There was a short period of time that she was put back in the care of her own mother, but then was taken again, and the final time when she was 9, and she did remember that day. Several cars of social workers pull up and just took everybody. They told my mom and all her siblings to give their brothers and sisters a big hug. None of them knew what was happening. They couldn't speak the same languages, and didn't see some of their siblings again for decades. They had no clue where they were all being sent, which ended up being entirely across the country. Thankfully for my mom and her siblings, they all did reconnect and had the ability to reconnect. 2 of them are not pictured in this particular photo, but they have been able to maintain a relationship, thankfully. But you can imagine, by living through that, my great-grandmother, my grandmother, and now my mother having lived through that, all at the expense of government, right? Like, I absolutely appreciate that too many families have experienced incredible hardships and traumas. It's less often that nearly all of those hardships and traumas were intentional legislation put forward by our elected governments. So that's a big difference here. And so it's really hard for us to just feel full faith and trust and a full embrace of anything coming from that top-down approach, like government saying, go get this vaccine, government saying, do this when it comes to birthing your child, because we haven't exactly been cared for very well. My mom, though, had the strength, determination, resilience, so much power inside of her that she ran away from foster care when she was 12 so that she could eventually have a family of her own that nobody could take away from her, because that's all she knew. So she did exactly that. She absolutely made a family that nobody has taken away from her. And I literally grew up in academia with my mom. She didn't go past grade 12, nor has my dad. But my mom, when I was in grade 3, registered for university and then later did a Bachelor of Arts in Native Studies and then a Master's in Native Studies, and then went on to teach Native or Indigenous studies for the next 20 years. So I grew up in academia with her. I saw the power of education. I followed in those footsteps quite literally, and hence my being here today. I think there's so much power in hearing stories and connecting that to the greater picture. There's a lot of power in education. Senator Murray Sinclair, who died just a year ago, noted that education got us into this mess, and education is what we need to get us out. although my mom created this family that nobody took away from us, unfortunately, she was taken from me, from us. My mom died just over 3 years ago, right on the day of my parents' 41st wedding anniversary. She died from colon cancer that was diagnosed just a year and a half prior, not even a full year and a half, and lived through 25 chemotherapy rounds. And this was truly the hardest time of my life. In fact, preparing this presentation, I had to take several hours away from it because I'm not healed. I don't know that I ever will be. And I just think about everything that my mom went through in order for me to even be here, and then reflect on the responsibilities I have of continuing on her education and lived experience to ensure that we don't see those things happen again, to ensure that people are privy to what went on and what still goes on as another attempt at eliminating racism in this country. My mom was so dedicated to Indigenous children and ensuring that they had the lives that they deserved in front of them, and ensuring that Indigenous children always found their homes. Even though she had a horrific experience in the 60s scoop, she decided, I don't know why, as her master's thesis, to focus on the few stories of good. So she wanted to show that some First Nations and Métis children ended up in a better path because of that very wrong policy that never should have happened. And she maintains that. But she still wanted to ensure that everyone had their stories told, including the few that ended up in a good place. When the government of Saskatchewan made an apology about the 60 scoop, both my mom and I presented together on the news, as we often did, in person or virtually. She even spent so many decades of her life volunteering for Child Find Saskatchewan to help children, primarily Indigenous children, find their ways back home. My mom had such a love and passion for children, again, particularly Indigenous children, hence the added meaning for my sharing of this topic today. This particular saying was framed on the wall in our kitchen for my entire life, and she wanted it on the back of her tombstone. My life, my joys, my pleasures, my hopes, my dreams, my treasures, my greatest loves, my very best work, my most cherished gifts to the world, my children. We have this really strong love for children in our communities because First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children still haven't quite had an overwhelming opportunity to just grow up in the same ways that non-Indigenous children have had the opportunity to do in this country for a very long time. We have so much love in our hearts for looking at the youth, the young ones, premature or not, those not even conceived yet, and wanting to have a good life for them. But it is so hard with all of these stories I've just shared. How can a person just do a 180 and have full faith in all of these systems and peoples and practitioners who have so enormously hurt us to the point of genocide, to suddenly feel like, sure, here's a brand new disease with a brand new vaccine technology and a brand new vaccine. Yeah, sign me up. It's hard to get to that point. My being here is entirely because of the sacrifices, strength, determination, grit, and love of so many who came before me. This is all their work and not mine, but this work is my responsibility. This country and the people in it did not see or even define my ancestors as people until 1951. Canada was almost 100 by this point, but the literal definition of a person was anyone other than an Indian in this country. My family line resisted and persisted so that someone like me could be here, so that someone like me could pursue post-secondary education, so someone like me could enter spaces like this one that were not made with, by, or for people like me, and so that someone like me might be heard. I also learned I needed to acquire these post-secondary Western colonial education degrees in order to be heard, in order to even be considered, in order to even be on the radar of consideration to be invited to speak. Folks don't invite my aunties, my uncles without the degrees, right? But it's their stories that you're hearing. We have this very weird world of only believing people who've gone through the confines and structures of Western colonial education and processes, and not always the people with the lived and living experience and expertise. So, on all of their behalf, here is some more of what I have to say about vaccine decision-making and Indigenous peoples. The legacy of the past and the continued policies and practices. I always add continued. I get really triggered when I hear someone mention, or when I read, like, the harms of the past or the legacy of XYZ. There is a legacy and there are harms of the past, but there's very intentional current oppression still happening in this country. The treatment of Indigenous children and peoples have left us with dramatic gaps in the social determinants of health and in the health and wellness achievements of Indigenous versus non-Indigenous people, and certainly vaccine decision-making is no exception. This is that exact article that was referred to and that I've referred to, of which I co-authored with Dr. Ian Mosby. It is an open access article, so I've chosen intentionally not for this presentation to be basically my reading of this article. This article will mention the 60s scoop, or mention residential schools, or mention the forced experimentation. But with this time I have with you today, I wanted to walk you through it, show you what it actually was, what it means, right down to a personal story. In a Canada that still doesn't provide water that's safe enough to drink or even bathe in for First Nations communities, it feels suspicious to be prioritized to receive a brand new vaccine, as I noted, using a brand new technology and for a brand new virus. And here I'm referring to COVID-19 specifically, but folks don't necessarily compartmentalize in their mind that, oh, this was the different technology for a different disease state and different virus than the RSV vaccine, than MMR, than any other vaccine. It's all part of the same system. And again, it's very hard to just take that 180 and appreciate that this is the good thing, right? The pharmacist in me, the Western practitioner in me, is so grateful for this new vaccine technology and new vaccine. And I'm grateful that we were prioritized to receive this first. But my role is not to share my gratitude. My role in this space right now is to share why it took people a little while to decide that they wanted to participate in vaccination, whether or not it was COVID-19. The First Nations, Métis, and Inuit were experimented on. We were the guinea pigs for vaccines in this country, particularly the BCG vaccine for tuberculosis. We were experimented on for vaccines, again, the nutritional experiments in residential schools and otherwise. An excerpt from that article about these vaccine experiments notes that previous and ongoing academic research shows, however, that the nutritional experiments were part of a wider pattern in the medical and scientific community's approach to Indigenous people at the time, which included experimentation and the persistence of certain types of surgeries that were no longer conducted on non-Indigenous people. Academic research also shows that many Indigenous people who died undergoing medical care for diseases like tuberculosis, of which that vaccine was experimented on us, they were buried in unmarked graves because Indian Affairs would not pay to take their bodies back to their home communities. So they were forced in these hospitals, forced to stay, forced back by the RCMP, or put in jail if they didn't stay. And then when they died in these very same hospitals, they were not ever taken further. They just were buried in unmarked graves and their bodies not returned to communities. It's taken a lot of work to change everything, to restore faith in Indigenous people's minds about this Western colonial system, about vaccines, about the medical care, about top-down approaches of people and organizations and governments and politicians claiming that they're here to help us, which I like to believe for the most part, but that has absolutely not been the case all the time in this country, as you've very well noted in this presentation. I was part of this one particular project that's really helped interrupt that cycle. So Sanctum, you can Google this, and I strongly recommend that you do. We have some really beautiful videos that capture the work of Sanctum. Sanctum Care Group now operates several different entities. One of those entities is on the bottom left, and that house is called Sanctum. And then the one on the bottom right is called Sanctum 1.5. And so that 0.5 represents baby, a pregnant person, and that fetus inside of them. These are for folks who are HIV positive or at high risk of acquiring HIV, who come to Sanctum 1.5 prepartum, and then they stay postpartum for a total of approximately 9-ish months during that entire period. And it has been so absolutely wonderful. Almost 100%, if not 100%, of the babies born to these folks would otherwise be apprehended. It's always the practice. Although Indigenous children comprise up to maybe a quarter or 1 in 4 of all children in Saskatchewan, we comprise about 90%, 9 in 10 of all children in the child welfare system. I could go on and on about why that's the case and the unfortunate reasons why that's the case. In fact, my mom, as a university instructor, created courses on Indigenous child welfare to share for a whole year information about exactly that. And of course, we don't have that kind of time today. But the point is that there's a lot at play, including attitudes and racism, that just deem Indigenous families not being appropriate homes for Indigenous babies. And so that, in conjunction with substance use, with an HIV positive diagnosis, apprehension, it just happens. And with the implementation of Sanctum 1.5, however, no apprehensions. The few babies who have been now in the child welfare system, it's been the request of that family, the request of that birthing parent. It's incredible how we can change the outcomes of Indigenous children and families by really coming together as a community and creating Indigenous-led organizations like Sanctum. The more we know about the Canada and Indigenous peoples' relationship, the more effective and better we will all be. I ask folks to commit to reading and listening and watching stories in your personal time, which I'm sure that this is the personal time for many of you participating now or watching the recording later. But I've listed several suggestions here of films, of podcasts, of books, of a paper. There's a really wonderful 2-page paper. That's the last bullet point noted here. A paper from Dr. Sheila McLean, who's a white anti-racist scholar and a co-founder of the Idle No More movement. And she wrote about the myth of meritocracy. I find that one 2-page paper is one of your best tools to interrupt racism. Often folks ask me, like, what can we do? And I have a lot of recommendations, some of which are just on the next few slides. But you as an individual human in this world, I ask that people interrupt racism. When it's not interrupted, we're kind of contributing to the problem, right? By our inactions. At a dinner table, in a coffee shop line, wherever you might be, that you are privy to some kind of racist thought or actions, please interrupt it. And that interruption will look a lot better and become more effective with the more that you know and the more tools you have in your toolbox to do so. And again, I think that 2-page paper is a really great tool to add to that toolbox, along with the rest of these resources on this page. You could consider reading this book. I have one chapter in here called The Whiteness of Medicine that talks a lot about our Western colonial system of healthcare and medications, vaccinations, and so many considerations about that. This book is called White Benevolence, Racism and Colonial Violence in the Helping Professions. So we chose the helping professions versus like healthcare because there are so many helping professions that might not rest under the umbrella of healthcare per se, but there's a lot to be learned about all of this. You could consider learning more about the tensions between Western and Indigenous worldviews in pharmacy education and practice. This used to not be cut off, but it looks like my upload into this StreamYard system reformatted a few things, so apologies for that. But I have a 3-page open access article series that highlights some really major tensions between Western and Indigenous worldviews, regardless of pharmacy, but healthcare, just life in general. And I think it will really help folks approach to all of these discussions and similar discussions to really, truly better understand the roots of why we're seeing what we're seeing. While I could share thoughts, stories, resources for much longer, our time together is essentially up, so I'm leaving you with just a few more thoughts. I noted that we need to change that trajectory. We need to interrupt what's always been truth. I try to provide some different examples for people to picture what it might be like for First Nations, Métis, Inuit folks in accessing a healthcare system, in thinking about vaccinations, in even deciding to show up to the healthcare system, deciding to show up to the ER, never mind the experience actually there. Just the thought process of, do I even go in the first place? One of the examples I found to be most effective is that I think that most people, at least in the audiences that I have been part of, have been through customs, have crossed borders. And usually when you're standing in line, even maybe when you're still on the plane, you're thinking about what this interaction is maybe going to go like with that customs agent. You know nothing about that customs agent. You don't even know their name. You don't know their gender identity, their pronouns, their life story, their age, if they have family members, partners. You know nothing about them. But you and I have made some decisions about what this interaction's most likely going to look like. We've probably determined that this is going to be a pretty rigid conversation, that we need to kind of rehearse what we're going to say. You know, where am I going again? For how many nights? Is this for business or pleasure? Which conference is this? When am I coming home? What day is that again? When they're looking at my passport, am I going to look them in the eye? Am I going to look down? Does that look suspicious though? Like, how should I be standing? What should I do? So much is going on, and we know nothing about that person. This is what it can and does look like for so many First Nations, Métis, Inuit, in even considering accessing healthcare. We have way too many examples of highly unfortunate, even fatally racist interactions in the system, experimentation done. I don't need to repeat everything I've just shared, but that all comes back to us every time that we're thinking about accessing care, that vaccination. Do I want my child, do I want my premature infant to receive any of this? Wait a minute, if I look at the track record of what's happened before, maybe not, right? A lot comes to surface, even when we don't know who that nurse is, that doctor, that pharmacist, that person, that vaccine, nothing. So this is not a personal attack on any one person. If some of you are care providers, family, friends of Indigenous folks who might have a premature infant considering vaccination, it's not about you. It's about everyone else and everything else that has happened, that we're taking a moment, maybe a few moments, to really consider, do I want this for me? Do I want this for my infant, for my baby, for my family? What I have found to be so effective are Indigenous-led everything. Indigenous-led resources. You see brochures here about vaccination. This is about vaccination in Anishinaabemowin, the language of Anishinaabe peoples. There are really cute and cool videos on YouTube and otherwise that were Indigenous designed. This is a screenshot on the right-hand side of an Indigenous cartoon YouTube video that highlights the importance of COVID-19 vaccinations. It focuses on protecting our elders. There's a special and different approach for so many kinds of peoples that just seem to be more effective. Sometimes promoting the health and livelihood of infants and newborns works best for people. Sometimes focusing on the care and protection of elders works best for people, and anything in between. So this video really highlighted, as one example, protecting our elders by getting a COVID-19 vaccination, by immunizing your child, by immunizing yourself. Even an Indigenous-led COVID-19, again, vaccination clinic has been so effective. These are photos. That's actually me giving a vaccine to the chief of the Saskatoon Tribal Council for COVID-19. The Saskatoon Tribal Council, which represents 7 different First Nations communities within a 200-kilometer radius of Saskatoon, they put on their own Saskatoon Tribal Council COVID-19 Indigenous Immunization Center. It was just incredible. The site that we used was the arena in Saskatoon, like where concerts and hockey games and stuff are. And even just the flow of your visit was really reminiscent and reflected Indigenous culture. So when you enter the building, you were given the option of doing a smudge, perhaps even saying a prayer or sharing a prayer with an elder or knowledge keeper or ceremony leader. The way that you would make your way through the whole clinic was in a clockwise fashion, and that's how we do things. That's even how you enter a sweat lodge. Even if you're sitting on the opposite side of a sweat lodge or another ceremony, you enter and go through in a clockwise fashion. There's a lot of teachings about a lodge or a ceremonial space reflecting the womb of our mothers. All of this was integrated into the design of the clinic. When you left the clinic after you received your vaccine, probably from an Indigenous immunizer, a nurse, a pharmacist, you were given a gift box of cleaning supplies, masks, and other gift-like items, stickers, all from Indigenous-owned businesses and companies. It was incredible, and it was open to non-Indigenous peoples too. People found a lot of faith and confidence and love and respect and cultural familiarity in accessing care in a place like this that was entirely Indigenous-led. We have so many Indigenous peoples, practitioners, nurses, doctors, pharmacists, physicians, like you name it. There's enough of us around now to be part of all of this. We're far past a time where we do things for Indigenous peoples. It's with Indigenous peoples, or just entirely done by Indigenous peoples. Nothing about us without us is the saying that we always use, recognizing it was first used by the disability community, but nothing about us without us. That's how we move forward. That's how we promote better uptake of immunizations among all Indigenous folks, inclusive of those making decisions for their premature infant. All this to say that we all walk a different part of this world, of this community, of this society, whether you are a parent, a child, a family member, a community member, a practitioner, an educator, whatever identities you carry, you have a role. And it might feel confusing about, what do I do now? I'm not sure what to do. It might feel like you're standing lost in a forest. But does that person who's lost in the forest find their way home by standing there? No. They are lost, yes, but they won't get anywhere if they don't start moving. I keep hearing people say, my role is to listen and learn. My job is to listen and learn. I'm going to listen and learn about this. And then I say, if I just always listen and learn about climate change, is the world going to cool down? No, don't forget about the do, get moving. You might be standing there in that forest, listening and learning, and I'm so thankful that folks are. but when and where is that first step happening? You might find at one point, oh, I think I've gone in the wrong direction. Cool. Turn around and go somewhere else. Change course. Learn from that mistake. But we'll never get anywhere if we don't do anything. That's all of my official content of this particular presentation. I promised I'd list my email address here, my office phone number, and then again, my social media handles if folks would like to be in touch in that way. But I know that there also is an opportunity now for our remaining 6-ish minutes together for any questions, comments, concerns, epiphanies, or otherwise. So I'll let Leah handle it from here.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that presentation. It was not what I was expecting. I don't know what I was expecting, to be honest, but that was incredible. And I can't think of a better way to finish off our season than with this and to sit with this as we go into 2026. So thank you so much. And even for being so vulnerable, because I know that as someone who works with families who, when you have a baby in NICU, we often talk about the trauma and the difficult journey of that. And when people revisit that to share their stories, it costs us something emotionally. So I so appreciate you taking the time to put this together and to share, and even your approach of like getting to know you better at the beginning, and that relational approach I really appreciate. So thank you.
Most welcome. Thank you.
I wanted to ask you a personal question since you shared so much, but how you as an individual was able to kind of, I don't know, hear all these stories and witness them and have it in your family so closely tied, and then able to go into a system that has so injured your people. How were you able to do that?
Sometimes I ask myself the same question, but I think I had the best role model, my mom. How did she live it?
She's amazing.
And then spend her career educating people about it, right? Like her story and her family story was so central to her curricula, like the content of her course discussions. And Indigenous studies, at least when she taught it at that university, it became a mandatory course for everybody. Actually, if you're going to get a degree at that university, you have to take Indigenous studies. I have a lot of thoughts about that separately, but anyway, the point is that meant that she got everybody, even the people who so vehemently disagreed and did not want to take Indigenous studies, but she captured them. Mm-hmm. It's so interesting to see how many of them said, I didn't even want to be here. I had all these types of preconceived notions, but it was your story. It was your approach to sharing it that changed everything for me. Mm-hmm. And people years later will say, I'm a registered nurse now, but I had your mom, even for one guest lecture, never mind the whole course, a guest lecture, and the impact she had on them was incredible. And I'm just thinking, oh my gosh, you know what? Even 1 hour with someone is an opportunity to do exactly what she had always done. So yeah, I hope that even though there has been all that pain and experience and it's so difficult, it's the story that changes things for people, right? Like when you read a news article, it's very different than watching a documentary about it. It hits you in a different way. So we need those stories. I've presented about the power of stories, why we need them. And it's also the lack of stories that even impacts our experience in the system too. Like I can't tell you how many times in pharmacy education, they might say to someone like me, first name only, don't even give anyone your last name. They don't need to know if you have kids, a partner, where you live, like nothing about you. You're the healthcare provider, keep it professional. Mm-hmm. And I'm thinking, for who? Mm-hmm. Right? Because if you want me to provide best possible care to the people from my community or even another Indigenous community, it's not that. It's me sitting on their hospital bed with them, talking about my grandma and showing them pictures. of my family, that's going to make the difference for them. So like this blanket approach of how we're taught to be in the system has continued to best serve non-Indigenous folks. So anyway, it's so multi-layered, and yes, there's been so much pain and it's really hard to do, but I found it to be the most effective, and I learned that from my mom. So you just kind of have to, right?
Yeah, I can tell she was incredible. The stories you told of your mom, and then even saying like an hour with somebody, Jairus, I feel like you're doing that. You're carrying that on because you've only had an hour with us. And I know that this will impact people. It's not just, showing up and talking about a study, like you said, which, we need those studies. We need to hear that. And like you said, sometimes we need the degrees in front of the names too. But it's the sharing of your heart and your stories, and really that will impact. And that's what I want to go to next in our last minute, is talk about, let's imagine the bedside nurse in NICU, okay, who's watched this, who's feeling the weight of it, as I am, and I'm sure other viewers are as well. And even hearing, okay, it's all right to go in the wrong direction, like just start moving. That's such a freeing statement to say. But for that person who watches and goes, okay, how will this affect my day-to-day practice as a solitary bedside nurse in NICU with families and our interactions? What's your advice for that person?
Yeah, I'd like to even go back to that customs agent example again, right? What would it look like for you walking through the customs line to have a totally different experience? What would that customs agent have to do or not do to change that trajectory of what it has always meant for you, right? Often the answer is not to spend time telling the person why you're different, right?
Yeah.
Like, can you imagine if you entered that customs agent and we're just kind of like maybe judging them, and if they started saying, oh, I'm not like the rest, I know that lots can be mean, or that's not me, and then that even makes you feel a little more suspicious in some ways, like, what's the catch here, or what are you not telling me, or this is the trick. What would be most effective if they just were great. They don't need to talk about why they're great or why they're different. Just be great, right? Be great. Be there to listen. Give people the self-agency to describe what they're looking for, right? Like, I might even say to someone, I know that even your being here in this hospital might mean a lot. It might bring up a lot. How can I best be here for you, right? Like, versus deciding what's best for you. Like, change the narrative. Let the guide, let the direction, let the plan of care come from that family, the person, the birthing parent, right? Maybe they would say something like, anytime I hear the word social worker, I've stopped listening to what you're saying, right? Just because of the trauma, and that I love the social worker and love what they're doing. It's just hearing it takes your mind somewhere, right? So the more you learn about that, the better you'll be. And you'll only hear about that by engaging in discussions and building relationality and engaging in presentations like this one. So lots of learning. Listen, learn, but don't forget the do.
Well, thank you so much for joining us here today. I know that I will be going back. I tried to write them all down, but I'm going to have to rewatch and take a look at those resources. I encourage, if you're watching this after the fact, go back, rewatch, take a look at those resources that Jairus has generously provided for us, and reach out as well if you have any questions. As I said before, I think this was an ideal way for us to finish off 2025. And I know that you have given us just a wealth of information and stuff to think about and hold in our hearts as we prepare for this new year. So thank you so much for coming and being generous with your time and your heart today.
Thank you.
And thank you, everyone, for joining us for today's episode and our final episode of 2025 of Preemie Chats. A special thank you to Sanofi for their support of educational programs such as this one. And we've said before, if you missed part of this episode or you want to revisit it, you can do that at canadianpreemies.org. And while you're there, you can explore the many resources and support options that we offer for families on their journey of prematurity. As a charitable organization, CPBF relies on the generous support of people like you. Your donations allow us to continue to empower families of premature babies every step of the way. Together, we can create a brighter future for all preemies and their families. Thank you for being a part of this community, and we look forward to seeing you again in 2026. Join us for our first Preemie Chat of the new year on January 9th. I look forward to seeing you then.